Welcome to The Writing Life, the podcast for anyone who writes. I'm Steph McKenna from the National Centre for Writing here at Dragon Hall in Norwich, UNESCO City of Literature. It's June 2023 and it finally feels like summer is in full swing in our fine city. We've just finished up another busy City of Literature festival weekend at Norfolk and Norwich Festival, including recording some very exciting conversations for the podcast, which will be landing in your ears very soon. In this episode of The Writing Life, NCW Programme Manager Rebecca DeWald had the pleasure of talking with Katherine, Gregor and Caroline Lamarche about the process of writing and translating The Memory of the Air, a novella by Caroline which explores a universal experience of gender and sexual violence and challenges common notions of victimhood. Katherine Gregor is a writer and translator. She primarily translates from Italian and French with the odd brief project from Russian and has so far translated over 30 books. Caroline Lamarche is an award-winning author of 11 novels and 6 short stories, as well as being a poet, scriptwriter and author of radio dramas. The Memory of the Air was translated by Katherine and published in English in 2022. Previously, Katherine has said that working with Caroline Lamarche's book is an honour and a joy. Every word, every comma counts. Her focused writing encourages a sense of intimacy with the text. Transforming the book into English feels like embroidering with silk thread the image traced by the author, because only silk of the finest quality and needlework of the highest precision will do. Together with Rebecca, they discuss how Katherine first discovered Caroline's book and the experience of it being rediscovered and translated in a post-Me Too era. Caroline talks about the process of drawing on personal experiences to write this book and about finding her voice. Please note that this conversation does contain references to domestic violence and sexual assault, so listener discretion is advised. So now I'm delighted to hand over to Rebecca in conversation with Katherine Gregor and Caroline Lamarche.
Hello and welcome. Thanks so much, Caroline and Katherine, for being here on This Writing Life to talk to me about The Memory of the Air, the book that Caroline, you wrote and Katherine, you translated. I was wondering whether we could, before we dive into our conversation about translating this memoir, novella, that would be one of my questions anyway about the genre. But if one of you maybe wants to give us a summary of the book, how you would describe it in your own words.
Well, Rebecca, thank you for having me here. It's a pleasure to be here. I think it's difficult to summarize this book because it's not a story from beginning to end. I would say it's an introspection. It's a process of various events in a woman's life, the narrator's life in this case. There is, I don't think it's a secret that there is a rape in the book, but the rape in a way, we're actually told about the rape only towards the end of the book, and it's only a few pages. So there's a lot more to the book than that horrid event. It's about a woman's processing of her surroundings, the rape, but also a past relationship with a man who gaslighted her for years. It's the way she responds to her upbringing, how her upbringing has equipped her or not, or partly for the life she has. So, and I'll let Caroline take over.
Well, thank you, Katherine, because I think it's a very nice way to summarize the book. In fact, it begins with a dream, and this woman, she dreams that there is a dead woman in a dream, a very quiet, smiling woman, very quiet, like herself after 20 years of being raped. She didn't want to think about it unless a man she loved very much told her, they were always fighting, and told her, well, you are the violent one. You told me you have been raped. You see, you have not solved this thing about the rape, so you are violent. And this is a second rape, I think, a second violence, which brings the story of the first rape, which was by a man with a knife. So, I mean, it was not only rape, it was almost imagining you will be dead in a quarter of an hour, I mean. this man could be mad, And so I think it's well, Katherine could tell it better than me because she discovered the text. I wrote it, but I think it's a text quite unemotional and still very emotional, because I like to write in a quiet way, almost cold way, quite ironic, and I think it's not the usual way about the rape stories. And I like when the angriness, you say, takes a time and is very strong because it becomes cold, and very precise. And that's the way I wrote this book after years. And so it was written before Me Too and translated after Me Too. And that is interesting because the translators, and I am very lucky to have such wonderful women translators, they discovered the text after Me Too. And I think this text is new again, is newborn again. I wrote it in 1940, in 240. Yeah.
You said that I picked up on, you said, you wrote the text, but Katherine discovered the text, which I feel like maybe says something about your relationship. And you said that again when you said the other translators. So the book has been translated into other languages as well. Can you maybe say about what you mean about the translators discovering the text? Do you mean the physical text itself and what they find in the text?
That's a question for Katherine, isn't it?
Well, you said about, you used the word, you feel that translators have discovered your text. So that's what Rebecca would like you to expand on.
Okay. Well, as you know, I am published by Gallimard with a very big publisher, and I am very happy to be with them. But usually I am discovered really by people who, like Katia, who find my book, and it's a kind of attraction, very strong, and then they decide they will do everything in order to bring that book in another language. And I think I am very lucky to have them. And I think Katherine could say, like others, that my writing seems simple and clear, but it's not so easy to translate because there are many layers in the text.
I would definitely agree with that. And that's what drew me to the book. The writing was the first thing that drew me to the book. At a time where I feel so many books are overwritten, every word counts because there are no extra words, and I actually found it surprisingly easy to translate, and that's because it's so clear. The words are not ambiguous. There are no frills. There are no ambiguities. You know what the author means. You may not know it mentally, but you know it emotionally. It's crystal clear. And I respond to writing like that very much. As a translator, as you know, we rewrite something, and we have a critical eye in the way that perhaps if we don't translate, you have no need to have. For example, I don't know, you may look at someone and say, "Oh, look, what an attractive person," whereas a medic will say, "Well, have you seen those varicose veins? Have you seen the rings under the eyes? Have you seen, the color of the skin's not quite right? There's a health issue there." And that's what the translator does with the text. Because when you're rewriting it, you notice so many flaws. You notice all the bits that, I guess when you read the book normally, you just skim over without really realizing it. And in this case, it was such a joy not needing to give the translation a polish. It was such a joy actually to be faithful. Translating is like a dance. For all the fact that translators are considered as writers, and we are, somebody has to lead, like in a dance in a couple, and the author needs to lead and needs to have a firm hand and needs to know where they're leading the other dancer. Otherwise, both tumble in a heap in the most ungraceful manner. And the way Caroline writes, you're in good hands. You know where she's going. She gently leads you and you follow. So obviously you need to know your steps. Any good dancer knows their steps. But there is that element of knowing you're in good hands and you do what you have to do because you're led very gently but firmly and clearly.
Well, I could add that the translators are the best allies of a writer. They are the most wonderful readers, and sometimes they tell me something about my text I didn't see well, but so I am also in good hands with Katherine.
No, that's really interesting. I'm wondering, because you already talk about the sort of intimacies of your relationship with the text and with each other. I was just wondering whether, on a more practical note, you could take us back to the beginning of the discovery process. Katherine, how did you discover Caroline? How did you discover the memory of the air before it was the memory of the air?
Well, I met Caroline through my husband, Howard Curtis, who had translated one of her previous novels. And then when we were living in Brussels, Caroline gave me La Mémoire de l'air as a gift shortly after it was published. So that's how I discovered it. I read it to be polite, but I actually, after the first page, I thought, this is an extraordinarily written book.
And how did it go from there? So you are the translator who falls in love with the book. What do you do?
What do? You start studying publishers' lists to try and see if it'll fit anywhere in our very poor translation market in the English language world. So I submitted it to, admittedly, not many publishers, because I needed to find the right one. I submitted to, I think, one or two earlier on, and then I stopped. I didn't submit to anybody for a few years because I couldn't find somebody I thought would give it the right home. And then when Ina Martis set up Héloïse Press, and I spoke to her and discovered more about her budding publishing company, I thought, I think this is the right place for Caroline's book. And I mentioned it to Ina, and she read it, and she also loved it. And the rest, as they say, is history.
So sometimes you have to write for the right time and for the right place.
Yeah. I think it's the most important. And in the translations of my books in Netherlands, Spanish, and English now, I must say there are young publishers very active and keen on defend and the books they publish, and their choice with French literature is very interesting. Among their titles are writers I like in France, in fact. So I am in a good company. We say that in French. Être en bonne compagnie.
Yeah, very good. And obviously, Caroline, you speak English very well. I don't know if you also speak the other languages of the other translations, but in terms of practicality of working together, do you read Catherine's translation? Do you kind of give feedback on the English translation, or answer? Yeah, Catherine's nodding as well.
Well, I always let the translator work, and if she or he needs to ask me some question, I am there. I answer very fast, and I like that. And every time I am, I find it so beautiful to read your own text in another language. I can read English, I can read Spanish, and a bit of Netherlands and Italian. And I think it's like discovering your book again, even if you have written it a long time ago, it's all new, and you recover the emotion as the day when you wrote it for the first time. And it's because you write a book, you never read again, you forget it, other books come after it, and then suddenly reading it in another language with a beautiful translation, it's like recovering all the emotion when you wrote it for the first time. That is a wonderful experience. And even in another language I don't know, I can, by the music or the rhythm, I can find my text again, Yeah. It's a question of rhythm and music also. I was first a poet, I still am. And so when a translator can, in the translation, give back the rhythm and the music of the text, the energy, I prefer this word, then is fantastic.
That's beautiful. And there's also something amazing about the book having undergone such a journey already, because you said you wrote it before Me Too. Mm-hmm. Then obviously Me Too happened, and then did some of the translations happen straight away when the book was published, and it's only the English one that's a bit later?
No. The Spanish and the Netherlands were published 5 years or 4 years after the publishing, like Gallifrey, yes. Like it was the right time, Yeah.
Because I was wondering whether that is something that obviously is a marker of a great text, that it can live through years and through changes, and actually almost anticipate changes as well. And whether that's also for you as the writer kind of forced you to go back to a text, because you have written books since then obviously as well, so it's an earlier text, and what that experience is like to kind of go back to a text that you actually wrote years ago, and maybe to some extent have already had a bit of closure on, or have you've written it, you've published it, you've done the marketing of it, and then maybe there's a way of moving on, and then there is the translations are coming and you're going back to this text, and a text that has, as we discussed already, a heavy subject matter as well. I was wondering what that was like to kind of revisit this text.
Well, for me, this text is still living. It's quite recent, and is one of my texts I prefer, in fact. And so when people ask me, which of your books do you advise me to read? Well, I have very varied books, I am quite eclectic. I like to speak about the book who had the Goncourt de la Nouvelle, this prize, very important for the short stories. And that was 4 years ago. But I often say the memory of the air. Yes, really. And I know why. So it's fresh. It's always fresh for me. You don't forget this kind of experience. And there are so many women and young women who have gone through that. But every story is different. That's why it's not enough to go to the police. You have to find your own words. And I worked a lot. Well, I wrote it quite fast, but I wait a long time without writing anything about that. I thought I would never write about this rape, my rape. But another violence, domestic violence came, and then the text came, and the dream about the dead woman. And I had to meet this dead woman inside me and to ask her her own story. And I found the words. And that, I think this book made of me another woman. I think if I hadn't written this book, I would have stopped writing. That's maybe why it's so important to me also. Yeah. Because when you say, because if you fail to, if the book is not in the right place, the right writing, you can experiment another form of rape. That means the reader don't like it, or you get very bad critics. But for this book, it was all the contrary. It was a risk, but I got a lot of respect after having published it. Yeah.
Katherine, I was wondering how you deal with that responsibility if you're, because as translators, obviously we have a responsibility to the source text and to the source author, and to you were talking about being faithful to it, and different translators will have different interpretations of that. But when it's a difficult subject matter, and it's also a very personal subject matter of something that is influenced by what happened to the author, how do you deal with sort of handling the text, but also in terms of a personal experience of like rewriting that trauma in a way as well?
Well, I think possibly how does a translator deal with it using the present simple? Well, maybe it's not appropriate because you deal with every book and every author differently. There's no hard and fast rule as to this is how you deal with it, except to say that you deal with it with as much respect as you can, with as much kindness, compassion, but respect covers all of those anyway. It's responsibility. It's also an honor. It's also a privilege to be able to convey something so traumatic and so beautifully and sensitively and well sort of expressed in the original to an audience, readership in another language. So I tend to respond to all my translations sort of intuitively before I respond to them so cerebrally. That's just the way I am. So I tend to do what, it's an awful expression, what feels right. But that's how I respond to all my texts. If I can't respond to them emotionally, intuitively, then I'm translating the wrong book for me. And I don't think empathy is necessarily that vital, but I think a certain amount of sensitivity is. So I'm not sure if I really answered your question correctly.
No, you absolutely did. I was also, this is a bit unfair for me, but I've got a quote, Katherine, one of your quotes actually, on on the translation, and that this is also what prompted it. Do you mind if I read out? It's you will be familiar with it. But you said about working with Caroline Lamarche's book is an honor and a joy. Every word, every comma counts. Her focused writing encourages a sense of intimacy with the text. Transforming the book into English feels like embroidering with silk thread the image traced by the author, because only silk of the finest quality and needlework of the highest precision will do.
Yeah, that sounds like me.
How do you
darling,
achieve?
I say so many things I can't. No, but seriously, on a serious note, yes, no, I think no, I definitely, I meant every word of that.
Yeah, I think that's what. So the first part of my question was about the intimacy, and the second part is about precision, the highest precision. How many drafts do you do? How often do you chip away at things? Because you actually said at the start it came to you quite easily because it's so precise. But how do you achieve that same level of precision in a translation?
Well, first of all, I actually do very few drafts. I basically do 3 in most things I translate, because my first draft takes a long time. I don't leave any gaps. My first draft is as close to the final draft as it gets, because the only gaps I leave are where I need to ask the author something. I feel like I'm not content if I go to bed at night and think I've got that gap there. I didn't solve that. I just doggedly solve all the vocabulary, all the meaning, everything in the first draft. Partly because I work so kind of intuitively. If I don't deal with what the intuition tells me at that moment, I forget. So I get back and I haven't dealt with it. I've forgotten what I meant to say. So I need to find what I need to say there and then. Also because I actually get bored rewriting translations too many times. I'm sorry, that's just, sue me. So the first draft is what I really want to do. Then if time allows, I will have, obviously I'll leave it a while, maybe a couple of weeks. That doesn't often happen in real life. But in this case, it did happen. I had that luxury of that couple of weeks to put aside, then revise it, and then another couple of weeks where I could do the final draft. And that is a bit of luxury that hardly ever happens. But I was given a generous deadline. And again, precisely because I felt this text so vividly, it was perhaps easier, in inverted commas, get it as right as possible than perhaps texts I find I fumble through, wade through lots and lots of unnecessary words. You think, which one do I leave? Oh my goodness, this person's used 5 synonyms in the same sentence. In this case, because it was so clear, it was actually the process was a lot smoother.
Caroline, you were nodding at some point when Katherine was talking about her process. I was wondering whether your writing process is similar. Is it quite intuitive that you write and then the first draft is already pretty much perfect, or are you an editor of your own writing?
Well, I was nodding at the first draft because I need my unconscious to talk, and you don't have to think a lot. You have not to be mental but emotional, and then afterwards I rewrite and write and rewrite, but it doesn't change much, but all is in the details. And I let also quite a time. I think time is an ally of the writing and translating, because sometimes you feel desperate about a text and you let it some time and you reread again and you found the solution very easily. So that's first, this text was written for the radio because I didn't want it to be published. And so I wrote it in a way for a radio play, in fact. And then it was written at Avignon, Festival d'Avignon. And then I thought, well, now maybe I can think about publishing it, because many people heard it in Festival d'Avignon. And so that was written by a very famous French comedian who is Dominique Blanc. So this confidence of Dominique Blanc and France Culture allowed me to think about this text, about publication by Gallimard. And I must say, the man I loved so much and who was violent and also very fond of literature, that's why I loved him so much, told me, if you write about our story, I'll kill you. So I had to go over that. That's why I didn't want this story to be a book. And I first asked to the France Culture if they were interested. And then once published, this man read the book after quite a time. And I wanted to meet him again. And we had an ultimate big fight. And that was really good in a sense, because after the fight, he told me, but the book is very beautiful. Your writing is very beautiful. And that's why I loved this man so much. Really, he was so clever for the writing. And I mean, literature won, really. And that's why I say this book, if I hadn't written this book, I wouldn't have never written another book, because I was threatened. The man who read me told me, if you shout, I'll kill you. And the man I loved told me, if you write this book, I'll kill you. So I went over. And I was helped also by, of course, Dominique Blanc, France Culture, Gallimard. All these people are around me once the text is there. And now Katherine is there, and you are there. And Aina Marti of Héloïse Press. It's fantastic.
But that is so powerful, and probably, unfortunately, all too common, the silencing of women, not only the victimization of women, but then afterwards telling women to be quiet, exactly, to not speak up about it, to not make a fuss, to like, and it's so impressive that you managed to get beyond that, because it's not a light thing being told, I will kill you if you write a book. I mean, how many people would say, I better not write a book then?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think, how could I say, you have gone through solitude, you mean? You are alone, but when you are a writer or an artist, you have also to have social cleverness. You have to accept the people who come and you say, oh, this one could help me. I could maybe ask him or her to read my pages. And it begins like that.
Has writing the book and seeing it having an afterlife, as it were, has that also kind of given you, I don't want to use the word closure because it's not a sort of thing that is in the past, but has that helped you kind of reclaim your story as well and finding your voice through that?
Well, I think really I became an adult after this book, because I began to write in a way more freely and with more pleasure. The pleasure now is really part of of my work. I can say that since the memory of the air. Yeah.
I did have, because we were talking about details earlier quite a lot. I know I didn't ask you to read any sections, but I did want to ask about the title itself. Specifically a "the" in the title, the memory of the air. Whereas I feel like I would have maybe said the memory of air, but that is also a very different title. Can you talk about the French title and choosing the English title, and what it signifies for either of you, because you might have different associations with the title, and why you chose it?
Well, in French, it's because in the book, this woman, she's alone with her lover, and it's a very violent couple. And sometimes when he's nasty or brutal, she's all alone with that. And but the thought which helps her is, well, the air is around me, and the air will always keep the memory of what I am living now all alone with this facing this violence. And I don't know, it's my intuition, but it's also a helpful thought, I think. The same way when I was raped, what thought helped me is to think of all the women in the world who went through that. So many. And during wars, it's even worse. It's even more terrible. So I think giving birth is difficult too. And when I gave birth to my first child, I thought about the other women too. I said, okay, it's very painful, but we are so many to live that at the same moment. And that's a memory not of the air, but of all humanity around us. Maybe it's the same thing, you know. Well, Gallimard told me, well, it's a beautiful title, but will people know it's a rape? It's not very commercial. So I said, no, but now everybody's happy with this title.
Well, I thought about it a long time, the memory of air, the memory of the air. But not actually, I didn't think about it for a long time. I take that back. I thought the memory of the air was the only possible title. Because apart from the fact, grammatically, the memory of air might mean you remember the air. Can be that ambiguity. And I didn't want ambiguity. The memory of the air, it's the air that remembers, is the air around us that stores all that's happened and is happening and is filled with it. And that's what I wanted to convey.
Yeah, and also it's the air of that day, you know, of that precise day. I think the translation in English is beautiful, the memory of the air. It's even maybe more precise than in French.
I like that discussion of which one's more precise now. It's all about precision.
But precision is a good thing. Precision is an underrated quality, I think.
Yeah, sure.
Because as it is, we can never completely and totally understand one another. That's just not possible. You know, if I use the word, the word green, you will think of, you'll think of an emerald, you will think of a fir tree, and I will think of Iago in Othello. I don't know, I'm just saying, for argument's sake. So we need our words, the words we use, to be as precise as possible, because as it is, they will never be precise enough, because words don't go as far as emotion. So I think we need to try, because they're like tools. I mean, you wouldn't want to sculpt a statue with a cleaver, would you? You'd need precision tools for that. And it's the same with words. Words is the only thing we have. So they need to be refined, they need to be polished, they need to be precise, they need to be like surgical instruments. They need to go exactly where you want them to go.
Yeah, and I could add that we live in a very emotional world, society. I mean, with a lot of confusion and a lot of manichees, black and white, and that's why we need to be precise, and we have also to leave space to the readers for their own emotions, and so it's better not to say too much. I trust the intelligence of the readers, and so I can leave some silence between my words. Yeah,
I agree with that 100%. I think as a translator and a reader, for my liking, there are too many books where the author guides your emotion. You think, well, I can guide it myself. Thank you very much. I think I agree with Caroline entirely that you can trust the reader to fill the space between the lines. And I think that's a compliment to the reader. And I certainly take it as a compliment as a translator that not everything is, although it's precise, there is that breathing space for me to absorb, and I'm given room to process rather than everything being sort of minced and chewed up and fed me.
You're obviously on the same page when it comes to what you think literature should do and how you approach your work. So I was wondering has this been a one-off collaboration, or is there anything in the pipeline that you're working on together? Katherine, are you translating more of Caroline's work? Caroline, are you writing something so Katherine can translate it?
Oh, I wish it worked that way. No, there's that little person in the between called the publisher. I mean, publisher in general, not Héloïse Press, but the publisher is there. There's that minor detail there. So it really depends on the publisher or the publishers. I mean, I have translated a few extracts of Caroline's work for the sheer pleasure of it, but they're sort of on the hard drive on my laptop. I would love to translate more. For example, there's not the latest, but maybe 2 books ago, Caroline wrote a wonderful book called La fin des abeilles, the end of the bees. Again, do we say the end of bees or the end of the bees? Do we say the end of the bees? Or the demise of the bees, which is a wonderful book. And again, there is that precision that gives you the room for compassion. But again, we are we need to. I hope very much that either Héloïse Press or another publisher will give another opportunity to Caroline's book. I would love to translate it, but ultimately, what's the most important thing is that the books should be translated.
Well, also I began to write quite late. My first book was I was 40, and so I am a young author. We can hope, but well, let us hope. I have plenty of projects, and I have beautiful things appearing now. I am in a very good period, I think. And this translation is a joy for me.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much. We're out of time, I'm afraid. But Caroline and Katherine, thank you for such a lovely, intimate and candid conversation about the memory of the air and your relationship working together. And we look forward to many more Katherine Gregor translations of Caroline Lamarche, obviously. So publishers, you've heard it here first.
Thank you very much,
Rebecca.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
A big thank you to Caroline, Katherine and Rebecca for their time, and make sure you pick up a copy of The Memory of the Air at your local bookshop. If If you have any questions or you want to get in touch, you can find National Centre for Writing at Twitter and Instagram at Writers Centre, on Facebook, and you can sign up to our newsletter over on the National Centre for Writing website. As a UK registered charity, we rely on the generosity of our supporters to make our work possible. You can make a donation today over on the website by going to the Support Us page. Please do subscribe to the podcast and leave us a rating and a review because it helps other people to find us. Thanks again, keep writing, and I'll catch you on the next episode.